a black attorney, returning home after winning a major civil rights case, steps into a bustling courthouse lobby expecting a moment of calm. But what happens next changes everything. A security officer, lacking cause, accuses her of trespassing, humiliates her in front of colleagues and clients, and within moments, escalates the situation to the point of an unwarranted arrest. 7 minutes later, she's sitting in a holding cell. What unfolded after this moment shocked an entire community and unleashed a series of events no one could have predicted. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. It all started on what seemed like an ordinary morning. The morning light crept into the streets of Atlanta, painting the brick facades of old homes and the glass fronts of new developments with the same golden hue. Though they belonged to very different worlds, Gabrielle Miles, sharp-eyed and deliberate, parked her sleek black sedan in front of a modest coffee shop. Her tailored blazer and crisp white blouse stood out in this part of the neighborhood, a quiet enclave where people still nodded politely as they passed on the sidewalk. The bell on the shop's door chimed as she entered, drawing a few curious glances. Gabrielle was used to those. She carried herself with the air of someone accustomed to occupying spaces that made others uncomfortable. As the head of internal affairs for the Atlanta Police Department, she had long learned how to navigate rooms where whispers preceded her. "Morning, Gabrielle," the barista greeted warmly, sliding her a cup of black coffee before she even ordered. It was one of the few places where she could find a semblance of normalcy, where she wasn't Agent Miles, or the woman who investigated one of our own. But even here, she could feel the unspoken tension of her presence, like the air after a summer storm. Gabrielle was only halfway to her car when she noticed him, a white police officer in a patrol car parked a block down. She glanced his way, her instincts stirring, but didn't linger. She had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize a gaze that lingered too long. As she merged onto the main road, the patrol car slid into traffic behind her. At first, she thought it was a coincidence. But after 3 turns, it was clear she had company. Her jaw tightened as she weighed her options. By the 4th turn, red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror. Gabrielle pulled to the side of the road, her hands steady as they gripped the wheel. She exhaled slowly, placing her license and registration on the dashboard before the officer even approached. When she glanced in her side mirror, she recognized the man, Officer Ryan Riker. His name was familiar from complaints filed with her office. None had gone anywhere, of course. Riker approached with the deliberate gait of someone who liked to make others wait. He rapped on the glass with 2 knuckles, a smirk playing at the edge of his mouth. "License and registration," he demanded, his voice clipped and cool. Gabrielle handed them over without a word, watching his expression shift as he read her name. For a moment, she thought he might back off. But then he leaned closer, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered weapon. "This your car?" he asked, his tone sharp with implication. "It is," Gabrielle replied evenly. "Is there a problem, Officer Riker?" His smile vanished. "Step out of the car." "Ma'am." Gabrielle hesitated, her pulse quickening. She'd trained herself to maintain composure in moments like this. With deliberate movements, she opened the door and stepped onto the pavement. The sun was hot against her back, but the air between them felt frigid. "What's the issue?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. Riker crossed his arms, his eyes scanning her up and down. "Your license says Gabrielle Miles. You match the description of someone reported for suspicious activity in this area." Gabrielle raised an eyebrow, biting back the sharp retort bubbling to the surface. She had seen this script play out before, but it was different when the lines were directed at her. "Suspicious activity?" she repeated. "In a blazer and heels?" Riker's smirk returned. "Let me decide what's suspicious." The weight of his words hung in the air, familiar and unwelcome. Gabrielle reached into her blazer pocket, watching as Riker stiffened, his hand flying to his holster. "Easy," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. Slowly, she pulled out her badge and held it up for him to see. "Agent Miles, Internal Affairs." Riker's smirk dissolved into confusion, then something closer to fear. He stammered, stepping back. "I didn't realize." "Quote, that much is clear," Gabrielle interrupted. Her voice was steady. But her anger was undeniable. You stopped me without cause, profiled me, and escalated unnecessarily. Does that sound about right? I was just following protocol, Riker said, though his voice lacked conviction. Your protocol, Gabrielle corrected, stepping closer, is why I have a folder with your name on it in my office. I know your record, Officer Riker. A flicker of panic crossed his face. And Gabrielle knew she had struck a nerve. He took another step back. But she wasn't done. Tell me, she said, her voice low but sharp. How many others have you stopped like this? How many people don't have a badge to shield them? The silence that followed was deafening. Just then, another squad car pulled up. Sergeant Cole stepped out, his expression unreadable. Gabrielle recognized him immediately. His name, too, was in her files. What's going on here? Cole asked, his eyes darting between Gabrielle and Riker. Ask your officer, Gabrielle replied, her voice edged with steel. He seems to have some interesting interpretations of protocol. Riker opened his mouth to respond, but Cole silenced him with a look. Turning to Gabrielle, Cole offered a tight smile. Let's not make a scene. Gabrielle stepped closer, her eyes locking on his. This isn't a scene, Sergeant, not yet. But if I file a report on this interaction, I imagine it'll escalate quickly. Cole's smile faltered. There's no need for that. Agent Miles, I'll handle it. You'd better, she replied, because if you don't, I will. Gabrielle got back into her car, her pulse still racing as she drove away. She had long known the insidious ways racism crept into the fabric of daily life. But even now, the sting of it left her breathless. This wasn't just an incident. It was a pattern. A system that protected men like Riker and Cole while others paid the price. As the city blurred past her, Gabrielle's resolve hardened. She had spent years unraveling the threads of corruption in the department. But this time, the fight felt personal. And this time, she wasn't backing down. The rain fell in a steady rhythm as Gabrielle parked her car in the precinct lot. She lingered for a moment, her fingers gripping the steering wheel, before stepping out into the damp chill. The air smelled of wet asphalt and tension, a fitting prelude to the day ahead. Inside, the fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow on the worn linoleum floors. Officers moved briskly through the hallways, their conversations clipped and hushed. As Gabrielle walked toward the Internal Affairs office, she noticed the shift in their gazes. Some avoided eye contact, others stared too long. Whispers followed her like shadows. Gabrielle was used to being an unwelcome presence in the precinct. Her position demanded it. Internal Affairs didn't make friends, it made enemies. But today felt different, heavier. The weight of her encounter with Officer Riker lingered in her mind. Not just for its brazen nature but for what it represented. She entered her office and found her colleague, Marcus Taylor, already at his desk. Marcus was meticulous, his attention to detail rivaling her own. He looked up as she closed the door behind her. You're early, Marcus said, his tone neutral but his eyes curious. Gabrielle set her bag on her desk and sighed. Something happened yesterday. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Waiting. Gabrielle recounted the traffic stop, her voice steady but laced with frustration. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression darkening as the story unfolded. That's Riker for you, he said when she finished. He's got a file thicker than the precinct's policy manual. Excessive stops. Complaints about his tone, racial bias. It's all there, but nothing sticks. His sergeant always backs him up. Cole, Gabrielle said, her voice flat. Marcus nodded. They've got a tight-knit group. Nothing happens to Riker without Cole pulling the strings. Gabrielle leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She had suspected as much. But hearing it confirmed stoked the embers of her anger. This isn't just about Riker. It's systemic. Marcus hesitated, then leaned forward, his voice dropping. There's more. I've been digging into the precinct's patterns. Riker isn't the only one with a suspicious record. Cole's entire unit has an abnormally high number of complaints from Black and Latino civilians. Traffic stops, searches, even arrests. And most of those complaints don't go anywhere. They disappear. Gabrielle's jaw tightened. Who's covering for them? Hard to say, Marcus replied, but it goes higher than Cole. Maybe all the way to the precinct commander. Gabrielle stood, pacing the small office. We need evidence, something concrete that ties them together. Marcus nodded. I've been working on it. I flagged a few cases where the patterns are too blatant to ignore. If we can connect the dots, we might have enough to launch a full investigation. Gabrielle stopped pacing, her resolve hardening. Do it, and keep it quiet. The last thing we need is for them to catch wind of this. Marcus hesitated. You know this won't be easy. If we push too hard, they'll push back, harder. Gabrielle met his gaze. Let them. I didn't take this job to keep the peace. I took it to seek justice. By midday, the rain had cleared, but the air in the precinct was no less charged. Gabrielle and Marcus worked through files, cross-referencing complaints, body cam footage, and case outcomes. Patterns emerged, subtle but undeniable. Certain officers stopped the same people repeatedly. Reports of suspicious behavior were disproportionately tied to minority communities. The data told a story of discrimination cloaked in the veneer of routine policing. As Gabrielle scanned another report, a knock at her office door broke her focus. She glanced up to see Sergeant Cole standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Agent Miles, he said, his tone carefully neutral. Got a minute? Gabrielle exchanged a glance with Marcus before standing. What can I do for you, Sergeant? Cole stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The gesture wasn't lost on her. I heard about yesterday, he began, his voice measured. With Riker. Gabrielle folded her arms. Did you? Cole nodded. He told me his side of the story. Said he pulled you over because of a report about a suspicious vehicle. Gabrielle's eyebrows shot up. Suspicious? My car or my presence? Cole's lips twitched, but he recovered quickly. Look, I'm not here to argue. I just wanted to make sure there's no misunderstanding. Riker's rough around the edges, but he's a good cop. He's dedicated. Dedicated to what, exactly? Gabrielle asked, her voice cold. Cole's jaw tightened. To his job, to keep the streets safe. For whom? Gabrielle shot back. Because from where I'm standing, his dedication looks a lot like profiling. Cole took a step closer, his tone hardening. Careful, Miles, you're walking a fine line. IA's job is oversight, not interference. Don't make this personal. Gabrielle's eyes narrowed. It became personal when your officer weaponized his badge against me. And it became my job when I saw the patterns your unit is leaving behind. This isn't oversight, Sergeant. It's accountability. Cole's expression darkened. You're playing a dangerous game. Gabrielle didn't flinch. So are you. The tension between them was palpable. A silent clash of wills. Finally, Cole stepped back, his smirk returning. Suit yourself, Agent Miles, but don't say I didn't warn you. He left without another word, the door clicking shut behind him. Gabrielle stood there for a moment, her heart pounding with equal parts anger and determination. He's nervous, Marcus said, breaking the silence. Good, Gabrielle replied, sitting down, because so am I, and I've learned that fear makes people careless. Marcus nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Then let's make them very, very nervous. As the day stretched into evening, Gabrielle felt the weight of the task ahead. She knew the road would be treacherous. But there was no turning back now. The truth was emerging, and with it, the promise of justice. But promises, she knew, were fragile things, and those who sought to break them rarely played fair. The sun dipped low on the horizon as Gabrielle left the precinct, the weight of the day trailing her like an invisible burden. The sidewalks were crowded, but the city felt quieter than usual, as if holding its breath. She clutched her bag tightly and walked briskly to her car, her mind buzzing with fragments of data, unanswered questions, and the sharp sting of Sergeant Cole's veiled threats. As she approached the parking garage, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Marcus, waiting near her car, his expression unreadable. What are you doing here? Gabrielle asked, startled but trying to mask it. Marcus glanced around before responding. I didn't want to say this in the office. Too many years. Gabrielle felt her pulse quicken. Say what? Marcus leaned closer, lowering his voice. I found something. A report buried so deep it almost doesn't exist. It's from 6 years ago. Filed by a rookie officer who left the force not long after. She accused Cole of suppressing evidence in a use-of-force incident. Gabrielle frowned. What happened? A man, black, unarmed, was beaten during a routine traffic stop. The officers claimed he resisted, but the rookie said otherwise. She said the dashcam footage was doctored before being submitted as evidence. She filed the report internally, but it was dismissed. A month later, she resigned. Gabrielle's jaw tightened. And the victim? Marcus hesitated. He filed a complaint, but nothing came of it. Then he disappeared, moved out of state, as far as I can tell. Gabrielle's mind raced. Do we still have the rookie's contact information? Marcus nodded. It's outdated, but it's a start. Gabrielle unlocked her car. Let's go. The rookie, Leah Daniels, lived in a modest apartment on the city's south side. The neighborhood was quiet but carried an air of resilience. A place where stories of struggle lingered in the cracks of the pavement. Leah answered the door after several knocks. Her face wary. She was in her mid-30s. Her features marked by an exhaustion that ran deeper than the day. Her eyes flicked between Gabrielle and Marcus. Can I help you? She asked. Her tone guarded. Gabrielle held up her badge. Leah Daniels? I'm Agent Gabrielle Miles with Internal Affairs. This is Marcus Taylor. We're here about your report from 6 years ago. The incident with Sergeant Cole. Leah's expression hardened, and she started to close the door. I don't want to talk about that. Wait, Gabrielle said quickly, her voice steady but urgent. We know what happened to your report. We know it was buried. But we need your help. Cole's still operating the same way. And it's only gotten worse. Leah hesitated, her hand resting on the doorframe. She glanced at Marcus, then back at Gabrielle. Why now? Why are you digging this up after all this time? Because it's not just one incident. Gabrielle said. It's a pattern, and it's hurting people. People like the man you tried to help. Leah's eyes softened, but only slightly. She opened the door wider, motioning them inside. The apartment was sparse but clean. A reflection of someone who kept their life simple. Perhaps out of necessity. I don't have much to say. Leah began, sitting on the edge of a worn couch. I told the truth, and it cost me my career. Cole made sure of that. What happened to the victim? Marcus asked. Leah sighed. His name was David Allen. He was a good man. A teacher, I think. He was driving home from a friend's house when they pulled him over. The officers claimed he was driving erratically. But that was a lie. They wanted an excuse. Her voice faltered, and Gabrielle leaned forward. Take your time. Leah shook her head. They beat him, broke 2 ribs, fractured his jaw. He never fought back, but they claimed he did. I saw the original footage. It showed everything, but when it came time to file the report, the video had been edited. The part where they attacked him was gone. Gabrielle's hands clenched into fists. And Cole? He told me to forget what I saw. Leah said bitterly. When I refused, he made my life hell. I wasn't fired, but they made it clear I wasn't welcome. So I left. Gabrielle exchanged a glance with Marcus. Do you still have any of the original evidence? Notes, emails, anything? Leah hesitated, then stood and walked to a small cabinet. She pulled out a folder, its edges frayed with age, and handed it to Gabrielle. This is all I kept. She said, it's not much, but it's something. Gabrielle opened the folder, her heart pounding. Inside were handwritten notes, timestamps from the original footage, and a copy of Leah's original report. This is more than something, Gabrielle said, her voice firm. This is a start. Back at the precinct, Gabrielle and Marcus pored over Leah's notes. The timestamps didn't match the official record, and her descriptions painted a damning picture of the assault. We need to find David Allen, Marcus said, if he's willing to talk. This could blow the whole thing open. Gabrielle nodded. I'll track him down. You keep digging into Cole and his unit. If there's more evidence like this, I want it. As Gabrielle made calls to locate David, a familiar unease settled over her. The walls of the precinct felt closer than usual. The air heavier. She knew Cole and his allies wouldn't go down without a fight. And every step forward made her a bigger target. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Stop digging, or you'll regret it. Gabrielle stared at the message, her resolve hardening. The threats didn't scare her, they only proved she was on the right track. But they also confirmed what she already knew. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about survival. The stakes had risen, and the line between justice and danger had never been thinner. Gabrielle took a deep breath, steadying herself. The fight was only beginning, and she wasn't backing down. Gabrielle Miles sat in the dim glow of her desk lamp, the hum of the precinct muffled by the thick walls of her office. The folder Leah had given her lay open, its contents a glaring reminder of the rot she was trying to expose. Each note, each timestamp, was another thread in the tangled web surrounding Sergeant Cole. But tonight, The weight of the work pressed heavier than usual. There was a new edge to the silence in the room, a tension she couldn't shake. The text message from earlier played on a loop in her mind. Stop digging, or you'll regret it. She couldn't stop digging. The stakes were too high, and the system had relied on silence for too long. The next morning, Gabrielle tracked down David Allen, the victim Leah had mentioned. He now lived 3 states away, in a small town that offered him the anonymity he craved after the incident. Gabrielle made the drive, her mind racing with questions. Would he remember? Would he even be willing to speak? David's house was modest, with a neatly trimmed lawn and a garden of winter flowers. He answered the door cautiously, his frame filling the doorway. His eyes, deep and shadowed, searched Gabrielle's face. Mr. Allen, she began, holding up her badge. I'm Agent Gabrielle Miles with Internal Affairs. I'm here to talk about what happened to you 6 years ago. David's expression hardened. I don't talk about that anymore. It cost me everything. My job, my health, everything. Gabrielle nodded, her voice steady. I understand, and I'm sorry for what you went through. But the officers who did this to you are still out there. And they're still hurting people. I need your help to stop them. He hesitated, his hand gripping the doorframe. You don't know what it's like, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. To be seen as a threat just for existing. To have your truth erased like it never mattered. Gabrielle met his gaze. I do. And I know it's not fair that the burden falls on you again. But you're not alone this time. If you speak up, we can finally hold them accountable. David's jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he might shut the door in her face. But then he exhaled, a heavy, resigned sound. Come in. Inside, David shared his story, filling in the gaps that Leah's notes had left. He described the night he was stopped, the lies the officers told, and the humiliation he endured. His voice shook as he spoke, but his resolve grew with each word. They called me a criminal, said I was a danger. David said, but all I was doing was driving home. How do you prove your innocence when the people accusing you hold all the power? Gabrielle nodded, taking careful notes. Do you remember anything about the dashcam footage? Anything that could help us find the original? David thought for a moment. There was a logo on the screen. A vendor or something. If you find out who serviced the cameras back then, they might still have the raw files. It was a long shot, but it was something. Gabrielle thanked David and promised to keep him updated. As she left, she noticed him standing by the window, watching her car pull away. She could feel the weight of his hope, fragile but undeniable. Back at the precinct, Marcus greeted her with a grim expression. We've got a problem, he said, leading her to his desk. He pointed to his computer screen, which displayed a list of complaints against Cole's unit. 3 of these people have filed complaints about harassment in the past year. Marcus explained, but 2 of them suddenly withdrew their cases and moved out of town. Gabrielle frowned. Moved? Or were they forced out? Marcus shrugged. That's the question. And there's more. One of the complaints included body cam footage. But it's missing from the file. It's like someone went in and erased it. Gabrielle's mind raced. The missing footage, the withdrawn complaints. It all pointed to a deliberate effort to bury the truth. And whoever was behind it wasn't just protecting Cole. They were protecting the entire system that allowed him to thrive. The tension came to a head later that evening when Gabrielle received a call from Leah Daniels. They know I talked to you, Leah said, her voice shaking. I found a note on my car this morning. It said, stay quiet, or else. Gabrielle's stomach dropped. Leah, listen to me. They're trying to scare you. But that means we're getting close. Are you safe? For now, Leah said, but I'm not sure how much longer I can do this. Gabrielle's voice softened. You're stronger than you think. And you're not alone in this. After the call, Gabrielle sat in her office, the weight of the day pressing down on her. The stakes were rising, and the lines between right and wrong were growing blurrier. She knew the risks, knew the toll this fight could take, but she couldn't stop. As she stared at the notes spread across her desk, a thought struck her. What if the silence was the point? What if the system wasn't broken, but working exactly as it was designed? Gabrielle leaned back in her chair, her resolve hardening. If silence was the foundation, then the truth would be the wrecking ball. And she was ready to swing it. The shadows were growing longer, but so was her determination to bring them into the light. The sound of Gabrielle's footsteps echoed in the sterile hallways of the district headquarters. The walls were adorned with plaques and portraits of decorated officers, each a symbol of the department's storied legacy. But beneath the polished surface, Gabrielle knew, lay a foundation of secrets and lies. Her meeting with the chief was set for noon, but she had arrived early, hoping to gather her thoughts. The folder under her arm contained evidence strong enough to shift the tide: financial discrepancies, testimony from David Allen, and clues pointing to missing dashcam footage. Yet, she also knew this fight was bigger than Cole or even the precinct. It was about dismantling the subtle, insidious mechanisms that allowed discrimination to thrive in plain sight. The chief's office was a stark contrast to the rest of the building. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with legal manuals and awards. Chief Harper was a tall man with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through whoever sat across from him. Gabrielle had seen those eyes before. Eyes that measured how much of the truth could be tolerated. "Agent Miles," Harper said, motioning for her to sit. "You've been busy." Gabrielle placed the folder on his desk, ignoring the tension in his tone. "I have, and what I've uncovered is deeply troubling." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "I hope you understand the ramifications of making accusations against someone like Sergeant Cole. His record is exemplary. On paper, maybe," Gabrielle replied, "but that record was built on the backs of people like David Allen. People whose stories were erased to protect the department's image." Harper's jaw tightened, but he said nothing as she opened the folder and laid out her findings. She detailed the financial ties between Cole's unit and an external contractor who conveniently lost dashcam footage, the coerced withdrawals of complaints, and the pattern of racial profiling that had been ignored for years. When she finished, Harper's expression was unreadable. "This is damning," he admitted, "but you're going to need more than circumstantial evidence to make it stick. Cole has powerful allies." Gabrielle nodded, her voice firm. "I know. That's why I need your support to escalate this investigation. If we let this slide, we're complicit." Harper leaned forward, his gaze unflinching. "Be careful, Miles. You're stirring a hornet's nest." As Gabrielle left the office, her phone buzzed. It was Leah. "I found something," Leah said, her voice urgent. An old colleague from Cole's unit reached out. "She's willing to talk, but she's scared. Can you meet us tonight?" Gabrielle's stomach tightened. Every lead felt like a step closer to the truth, but also closer to danger. "Text me the details. I'll be there." That evening, Gabrielle met Leah and the colleague, a woman named Tasha Green, at a small diner on the outskirts of town. Tasha was jittery, her eyes darting to the door every few seconds. "You're safe here," Gabrielle assured her, sliding a cup of coffee across the table. Tasha hesitated before speaking. "I worked under Cole for 3 years. At first, I thought he was just tough. But then I started noticing things. The way he'd target black drivers. The way he'd dismiss complaints. Even brag about how no one could touch him." Leah placed a reassuring hand on Tasha's arm. "You don't have to carry this alone." Tasha nodded, her voice trembling. "I saved some files before I left. Emails and incident reports. I didn't know what to do with them. But if they can help, I'll turn them over." Gabrielle's pulse quickened. "That could be the evidence we need. But you'll have to be ready for backlash." Tasha's eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. "I've stayed silent long enough." The next morning, Tasha's files landed on Gabrielle's desk. They were a treasure trove of damning evidence. Explicit emails from Cole mocking victims, instructions to falsify reports, and even communication with higher-ups who encouraged his behavior. But just as Gabrielle began piecing the puzzle together, Marcus rushed into her office. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice tense. "There's been a data breach. Someone's accessing files related to the investigation." Gabrielle's blood ran cold. "How is that possible?" Marcus shook his head. "I don't know, but whoever it is, they're trying to cover their tracks." Gabrielle's mind raced as she worked to secure the evidence. The breach wasn't just a sign of desperation. It was a warning. The higher she climbed, the more resistance she faced. The system wasn't just broken, it was self-sustaining, designed to protect those who thrived within its cracks. By the end of the day, Gabrielle sat at her desk, staring at the mountain of evidence. The challenges were escalating, but so was her resolve. This fight wasn't just about justice for the victims. It was about dismantling a culture that normalized injustice. And if the walls of the precinct cracked under the weight of her investigation, So be it. Justice, she thought, wasn't about comfort. It was about truth. The precinct was buzzing with an unusual energy. Whispers moved like static between officers, some glancing at Gabrielle with a mixture of suspicion and resentment. She knew why. The files leaked from Tasha Green's collection had been circulated among the higher-ups. And the names implicated were more than just familiar. They were pillars of the department's power structure. Gabrielle had lit a match, and the fire was spreading. The meeting room was suffocatingly tense. Gabrielle stood at the head of the table, presenting her findings to a review board. The panel, composed of seasoned officers and city officials, stared back at her with a mix of concern and defensiveness. Sergeant Cole's record, when examined without scrutiny, appears pristine, Gabrielle began, her voice steady despite the weight in the room. But when cross-referenced with the complaints and suppressed reports uncovered by my team, a clear pattern emerges. This is not a case of isolated misconduct. It's systemic abuse. One official, an older man with salt and pepper hair, leaned forward. Agent Miles, are you suggesting that this precinct has knowingly enabled racial profiling in misconduct for years? Gabrielle met his gaze, unflinching. Yes, and the evidence supports that claim. The room erupted into murmurs. Harper, seated at the corner of the table, cleared his throat loudly, silencing the noise. This is a serious accusation, Harper said, his tone careful, one that could have consequences beyond this precinct. That's precisely the point, Chief, Gabrielle replied. This isn't just about one officer or one department. It's about the culture that allows officers like Cole to act with impunity. Another official, a younger woman with a sharp gaze, spoke up. What's your proposed course of action, Agent Miles? Immediate suspension of all implicated officers, Gabrielle said, her voice firm. An independent review of every complaint filed over the last decade. And public accountability. Without transparency, trust cannot be restored. The salt and pepper official scoffed. Public accountability? Do you have any idea how this will look to the media? To the public? Gabrielle's jaw tightened. It'll look like we're doing the right thing. Or would you prefer the public finds out another way? The tension in the room reached its breaking point. Harper raised a hand, signaling for quiet. We'll reconvene tomorrow to vote on Agent Miles's recommendations. Until then, this discussion is adjourned. As Gabrielle left the meeting room, Harper caught up with her in the hallway. You're playing a dangerous game, Miles, he said, his voice low. These aren't just officers you're going after. They have connections, powerful ones. I'm not playing, she shot back, and if they have something to hide, maybe they shouldn't have worn the badge. Harper studied her for a moment before shaking his head. Just watch your back. That evening, Gabrielle's apartment felt unusually quiet. She sat at her desk, combing through the files once more. Her phone buzzed. A message from Leah. Marcus and I found something. It's bigger than we thought. Meet us at the office. Gabrielle grabbed her coat and headed out. The air was heavy with the promise of rain as she drove through the city. When she arrived at the Internal Affairs building, she found Leah and Marcus waiting, their expressions grave. What's going on? Gabrielle asked. Leah handed her a tablet. On the screen were financial records showing large sums of money moving between a private security firm and the precinct's discretionary fund. The transactions were labeled community outreach, but the amounts were staggering. This isn't outreach, Gabrielle said, scrolling through the data. It's hush money. Marcus nodded. And it's tied to a private contractor who specializes in media management. They've been suppressing stories about the precinct for years. Gabrielle's stomach churned. How deep does this go? Deep enough that we're getting flagged. Leah said, our systems were probed earlier. Someone's watching us. The next day, Gabrielle arrived at the precinct to find her office ransacked. Papers were scattered, drawers left open. On her desk was a single note, back off. Her chest tightened, but she refused to show fear. Instead, she called Marcus and Leah, instructing them to increase their security protocols. When Harper heard about the break-in, he confronted her in his office. This is what I meant. Miles, he said, his voice tinged with frustration. You've stirred up something that might be bigger than you can handle. I'm not backing down, she replied, and neither should you. If we don't act now, we're complicit. Harper sighed, rubbing his temples. You're relentless. I'll give you that. It's not about me, Gabrielle said. It's about the people we're supposed to protect. That afternoon, Gabrielle and Leah met with a whistleblower from the private security firm implicated in the financial records. The man, a wiry figure named Victor, was visibly nervous. "I don't have much time," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "But you need to know. They're not just covering for bad cops. They're running a coordinated effort to discredit anyone who speaks out. Journalists, activists, even victims." Gabrielle's heart sank. "And the department is funding this?" Victor nodded. "They call it damage control. I call it blackmail." As night fell, Gabrielle sat in her apartment, staring at the city skyline. The weight of the investigation pressed against her. But she knew there was no turning back. The threats, the resistance, it was all proof that she was getting closer to the truth. In the quiet, she thought of the people who had been silenced. The lives disrupted by a system designed to protect itself. For them, and for the future, she resolved to keep fighting. Justice wasn't just a destination. It was a journey, and Gabrielle Miles was prepared to walk it, no matter how steep the path became. The morning sun cast long shadows over the precinct parking lot as Gabrielle Miles stepped out of her car. There was a palpable tension in the air, a sense that the world was shifting underfoot. Today wasn't like other days. The evidence she and her team had compiled, the names, dates, and sums of money, painted a damning picture of systemic corruption. It was all ready to be unveiled at the afternoon press conference. A moment designed to break the silence. But even now, Gabrielle felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her shoulders. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was even heavier. Gabrielle could feel the stares from officers as she passed. Some curious, others hostile. Whispers trailed in her wake, punctuated by the occasional snicker or a sarcastic, "There goes the hero." She stopped at Leah's desk, where her colleague was furiously typing, her face illuminated by the pale glow of her monitor. "Anything new?" Gabrielle asked. Leah nodded, her expression grim. "Another flagged message. This one's from an anonymous source. But it's different, more direct." She turned the screen to Gabrielle, who read the short, chilling sentence. "The press conference won't happen. Walk away while you can." Gabrielle clenched her jaw, her stomach tightening. "They're desperate. They're scared," Leah corrected, glancing at her. "You've got them cornered." Gabrielle shook her head. "Fear makes people dangerous. We had to be ready for anything." The hours leading up to the press conference were a blur of final preparations and mounting anxiety. Gabrielle briefed her team, ensuring every piece of evidence was secured. She double-checked the chain of custody for the financial records, the body cam footage, and the emails linking officers to the private contractor. The case was airtight, but the threats loomed large in her mind. As the clock ticked closer to 2 o'clock, Harper called Gabrielle into his office. His expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his posture that betrayed his unease. "Close the door," he said, motioning for her to sit. Gabrielle compiled but remained silent, waiting for him to speak. "I got a call this morning," Harper began, his voice low, "from the mayor's office. They're worried about the fallout from this press conference." Gabrielle folded her arms. "The fallout is the point. People need to know what's been happening." Harper sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You're right, but you should know. Not everyone sees it that way. There's pressure to downplay this, to spin it as a few bad apples rather than a systemic failure." Gabrielle's eyes narrowed. "And what do you think?" "I think it's about time we stop pretending we're not part of the problem," Harper said, his tone hardening. "But you need to be careful. There are people who would rather see this swept under the rug. And they won't hesitate to come after you." Gabrielle nodded, standing. "Let them try." The press conference was held in a small auditorium downtown, packed with reporters, community leaders, and concerned citizens. Gabrielle stood at the podium, flanked by Leah and Marcus. The evidence was projected on a screen behind her, damning records of bribes, emails detailing cover-ups, and video footage of officers abusing their power. "Today, we lay bare a truth that has been buried for too long," Gabrielle began, her voice steady despite the nerves churning in her stomach. "This is not just about individual misconduct. It's about a culture that has allowed abuse, discrimination, and corruption to flourish unchecked." The audience was silent, hanging on her every word. For years, complaints have been ignored, victims have been silenced, communities have been devastated, and the people responsible for upholding the law have betrayed the trust placed in them. As she spoke, Gabrielle noticed a man in the back of the room, his gaze fixed on her. He was dressed in a dark suit, his demeanor calm but unsettling. She recognized him from the files Leah had uncovered, a senior executive from the private security firm tied to the corruption. He wasn't here for the press conference. He was here to intimidate her. Gabrielle pushed forward, her voice rising. But today, that silence ends. We have the evidence, we have the truth, and we are demanding accountability. The room erupted into applause as Gabrielle stepped back from the podium. Reporters shouted questions, and cameras flashed, but her focus remained on the man in the back. He gave her a small, cold smile before slipping out of the room. That evening, as Gabrielle returned to her apartment, she felt a rare sense of relief. The press conference had gone as planned. The public knew the truth, and the city was demanding action. But as she unlocked her door, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. You made your choice. Now deal with the consequences. Gabrielle froze, her mind racing. She quickly scanned her apartment, searching for signs of tampering. Everything seemed normal, but the message left her rattled. She called Leah, her voice steady but urgent. We need to tighten security. I think they're escalating. Leah didn't hesitate. Got it. I'll alert Marcus. As Gabrielle hung up, she stared out her window at the city below. The lights flickered in the distance, a reminder of the lives she was fighting for. The threats were real, and the risks were growing. But Gabrielle knew one thing for certain. She wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The morning began with an ominous stillness, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Gabrielle Miles stood in the conference room at Internal Affairs. The faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. The files and recordings on the table represented months of relentless effort. Evidence not just of individual corruption, but of an entrenched system designed to protect those who abused their power. Her team worked quietly around her, their usual camaraderie replaced by a tense determination. They all knew this was the tipping point. The press conference had drawn attention from city officials, the media, and even federal agencies. The public demanded accountability, and Gabrielle's name was now synonymous with the fight for justice. But behind the applause, there were murmurs of backlash. Powerful forces trying to silence her. Agent Miles. Leah's voice broke through Gabrielle's thoughts. We've got a problem. Gabrielle turned to see Leah holding her phone, her face pale. Another message? Gabrielle asked, her voice calm but firm. Leah nodded. Worse, the private security firm filed an injunction. They're claiming our evidence was obtained illegally. If the judge sides with them, it could delay everything. Gabrielle's jaw tightened. How long do we have? The hearing is in 2 hours. Leah said. Their lawyers are already at the courthouse. Gabrielle glanced at the clock, then at the team. Leah, notify the legal department. Marcus, I need you to compile a timeline showing how we obtained every piece of evidence. If they're going to play dirty, we'll be ready. 2 hours later, Gabrielle sat in the courthouse, facing a row of suited attorneys representing the private security firm. The lead lawyer, a polished man with a shark-like smile, argued that the search warrant used to obtain key documents was flawed. This entire investigation is a farce, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. My clients have been unjustly targeted by an overzealous agent with a personal agenda. Gabrielle didn't flinch. When it was her turn to speak, she rose with quiet authority. Your Honor, she began, meeting the judge's gaze. This isn't about a personal agenda. This is about justice for communities that have been terrorized and silenced. The evidence was obtained legally, and it speaks for itself. She presented the timeline Marcus had prepared, meticulously detailing each step of the investigation. As she spoke, she could feel the tension in the room shift. The judge's expression softened, and even the opposing lawyers exchanged uneasy glances. When the hearing concluded, the judge ruled in Gabrielle's favor. The injunction was denied. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed her, shouting questions. Agent Miles, are you concerned about retaliation? Do you think this investigation will lead to convictions? Gabrielle stopped, her face calm but resolute. This is just the beginning. Justice takes time, but we will see it through. That evening, Gabrielle returned to her apartment. Exhausted but determined, she sat at her desk, reviewing the latest developments. The press was amplifying the story, and community leaders were rallying behind her. But as she sifted through emails and notes, Her phone buzzed with another message from an unknown number. "You think you've won. You have no idea what's coming." Gabrielle stared at the screen, her heart pounding. The threats were becoming more direct, more personal. She called Leah. "They're escalating," Gabrielle said. "I need you to secure the files. Backups in multiple locations. Encrypted." Leah's voice was steady. "Already done. But Gabrielle, you need to be careful. They're not just trying to scare you. They're trying to stop you." The following day, Gabrielle and her team met with federal investigators. The evidence they presented was damning: financial records, emails, body cam footage, and testimony from officers who had turned whistleblower. The federal agents were impressed, but cautious. "This goes deeper than we expected," one of them said. "If we move too quickly, they might destroy more evidence. Or worse, retaliate." Gabrielle nodded. "Then we move smart. Strategic arrests, targeted warrants. We take away their ability to cover their tracks." The plan was set in motion. Over the next 48 hours, several high-ranking officials were arrested, including the CEO of the private security firm. The news sent shockwaves through the city, and protests erupted in support of the investigation. But Gabrielle knew the fight wasn't over. The system they were dismantling was vast and deeply entrenched. Every victory came with new challenges, new threats. On the third night after the arrests, Gabrielle received a call from Marcus. "You need to come to the office," he said, his voice tense. "We found something in the financial records. Something big." When Gabrielle arrived, Marcus showed her a document linking the private security firm to city officials, including members of the mayor's staff. The corruption extended far beyond the precinct, into the highest levels of local government. "This is the smoking gun," Marcus said. "But if we go public with this," Gabrielle finished the thought, "it'll blow everything wide open." The decision to expose the broader corruption wasn't easy. Gabrielle knew it would make her an even bigger target. But she also knew she couldn't stop now. The next morning, she held another press conference, revealing the new evidence. The backlash was immediate. Critics accused her of overstepping, of jeopardizing public trust. But the public response was overwhelmingly supportive. That evening, as Gabrielle left the precinct, she found a note on her car windshield. "We warned you." She looked around, her senses heightened, but the street was empty. Sliding into her car, she took a deep breath. The threats were real, but so was her resolve. In the weeks that followed, the investigation expanded, federal authorities took over, and Gabrielle's team provided critical support. The arrests continued, and the city began to reckon with the depth of its systemic failures. At a community meeting, Gabrielle listened as residents shared their stories. One elderly woman stood and spoke through tears. "For years, we thought no one cared. But you proved us wrong. You gave us hope." Gabrielle felt a lump in her throat. She nodded, her voice steady. "This isn't just my fight. It's ours. And together, we'll make sure this never happens again." As she left the meeting, Gabrielle knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. But for the first time, she felt the weight of her fight beginning to lift. The truth was out, change was coming, and she was ready for whatever came next.